is time for our second speaker, Rethinking Business for a Better World. And the angle, of course, is corporate philanthropy. Our speaker is Joe Wheeler. He's an expert in corporate philanthropy with experience launching social impact initiatives at companies such as Dropbox and WhatsApp, and also with the United Nations Development, which is fantastic. As I mentioned, I asked each of my speakers today, what are three things you want the audience to know that are not in the event description that everyone read when they signed up and when they got my millions of reminders? And these are the three things Joe wanted me to share with you. He has spent his career launching philanthropic programs and looking for ways to improve the field. He is a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon in the School of Public Policy, researching corporate philanthropy. And he's a member of the business operations team at Open Philanthropy. However, the views he will be expressing today are his own, not the views of the organization where he is working. So that's it. Without further ado, thank you so much, Joe, for being with us. Joe, unlike our previous speaker, is not at an airport waiting for a flight to a remote island. So I think he'll have less of the sound challenges, and hopefully it will all be nice and smooth. Jason did such a good job in spite of the challenges. Take it away, Joe. You can share your screen now.
I am delighted to be here and spending some time with you all. Um, the topic for today's talk is power sharing in new philanthropy. And I thought I would start with a little bit of my own experience launching the Dropbox Foundation. I was very privileged early in my career to be working on social impact programs at Dropbox when it was a fairly small startup. And I learned a lot along the way. So I thought I would share that with you all. Second, because I am a PhD candidate, I thought I would add a couple theoretical perspectives from academia as well to complement the real world example with some perspectives from other scholars. So I'd like to start with a little bit of a story. I finished undergrad in 2011 and I wanted to do something good. So my first experience out of college was joining the Peace Corps. So that's me on the left-hand side in Mongolia, standing in front of a monastery. I was teaching English in a vocational school and doing other community-based projects for 2 years, living in the Gobi Desert. So that picture on the bottom is actually the town that I lived in, always surrounded by camels, very desolate, very beautiful. And my first corporate job after coming home, I was kind of sending my resume anywhere that would take a look. My older brother worked at Dropbox, so was able to refer me. I had no tech experience, no HR experience, but I got in as a recruiter. But I think there were something like 3 weeks between leaving the US for 2 years and coming and not coming back the whole time, and then starting a new job sort of in the heart of San Francisco at the peak of like the smartphone boom, app boom, you know. So these two work experiences next to each other were very, very different. And I think my mindset, you know, after getting water from a well, building fires every day to stay warm, you know, not having electricity, running water, etc., in my yurt in Mongolia, and then being in this kind of extravagant, lavish tech office, my initial thought was we should be giving more of this away. How can we start some sort of a community-based volunteer or philanthropic program? So it was very grassroots. I just started emailing people at the company who I thought were smart and maybe wanted to partner with me. And what started as like a weekly meeting group ended up being my full-time job over the next several years there, and something that the company really put a lot of support behind. So phase one of what this looked like, we called it Dropbox for Good, and it included matching employee gifts. So you could make a donation up to $1,000 annually and the company would match it, taking 32 hours of paid volunteer time off, and every individual Dropbox employee got to choose a nonprofit that they wanted to sponsor for a free enterprise account. So this is kind of like a typical CSR program, I would say. I would characterize this as like a strong phase one. It was very scrappy in our sort of startup ethos. I put an idea out there, and my colleagues, wanted to support it and make it happen. It was about, maybe a third of a percent of annual operating revenue, so a relatively small slice of the pie for Dropbox, but a big win for sort of employee morale and culture boosting. But also structurally limited, right? This was more about employee choice, not particularly strategic in terms of how we were making an impact and how we were measuring that impact. So after doing this as a side project for a couple years, eventually the founders, before the company had its IPO, so before it went public, they said, "Hey, we're thinking about doing a foundation. Because you've already been sort of grassroots organizing a lot of these social impact projects, can you look into like if we should do this, and why? Do some peer benchmarking, so get a sense from other tech companies of a similar size of how they've done foundations and what they've learned, any pitfalls that they would recommend avoiding. What should we focus on? How should it be incorporated? What should our grant making strategy be?" So my focus then became to project manage the creation of the Dropbox Foundation. The first question of why do this and why now? I think the first principles, we just wanted to have a solid impact. That seemed aligned with our company values. One of our values is we, not I. And so that includes, not just employees and customers, but communities writ large, broader stakeholder groups. It's also fairly table stakes for companies to launch philanthropic programs. And there are studied and proven business benefits as well when it comes to retention, recruitment, customer loyalty, etc. It's also much easier to start a program like this as a pre-IPO private company. If you declare philanthropic expenditure in a document called an S1, it's something that companies have to file before they make a public offering, then it's much harder later on for shareholders to claim that you're not acting in the sort of fiduciary responsibility of the company. Michelle, you have a hand up? I think you're
Completely by
muted.
accident. I am so sorry.
Oh,
I
that's
apologize.
okay. No worries. No worries. So yeah, so pre-IPO flexibility, very easy to do as a private company. There's a lot of text on this screen, so I won't go into all of it, but I just wanted to share a couple of the common takeaways from these benchmarking meetings that I did. So over the course of 2 months, I met with every sort of head of tech foundation in the Bay Area that I could get a hold of. And there's a lot of different models for what this looks like, right? So on the left-hand side, you can see 4 of the 22 that I talked to were in-house programs, meaning they fund their CSR and philanthropy just through their kind of operating expenses. 10 were 501c3 foundations, so separately incorporated nonprofits. 3 were donor-advised funds, where you essentially manage your assets through a public charity or a financial advisor, and then you tell them kind of what your strategy is and where to spend it, and then some combination. I put on bold a couple things that I think are really important. So one of the things that I learned, focus on the impact that we're already having and how the social impact program can be an extension of that. So to speak on that a little bit, what are the comparative advantages that companies have that individual donors don't? Because you could just sort of raise everybody's wages and encourage them to donate individually, but like why do a corporate foundation? And I think that part of the answer lies in the assets that companies have that aren't just cash, right? So there's also the products that they make. There's the facilities that they have. There's the intellectual capital, the social capital. So Airbnb, for example, has this huge global infrastructure of housing. And instead of just giving grants to charities or NGOs. They have an open homes program where refugees and other vulnerable communities can stay in Airbnbs for free, and then the company compensates the host rather than the tenant compensating the host. Right? So there's this amplifier where they're not just giving cash, but they're using the core infrastructure that they've already spent, all the fixed costs to make, which is way more effective than an individual donor trying to do something like that. Similarly, LinkedIn's philanthropy is all about workforce development and helping people get jobs, which makes sense for LinkedIn given the core focus of what their business is. So this was something that I learned from this process that really stuck with me. So what to focus on? What should the Dropbox Foundation do? I want to speak a little bit about this and the process that we took to sort of determine what our focus area is. I wanted this to be an extension not just of my own thinking on the topic, but of the whole company. So I did working sessions with more than 30 staff across global offices from varying departments, varying seniority levels. And essentially we just asked them, like, what would you do if you had a foundation? And then we took all the suggestions that we got and stress tested recurring themes against different principles that we decided with the leadership team were valuable. So for example, having natural linkages to our product, resonating with and engaging founder, staff, and all employees globally. And then third, an unsaturated area of focus among technology companies. And then that's the one that I want to double click on a little bit. So if we were to pick something that other companies already give a ton of funding to, let's say STEM education. I think Microsoft gives something like $500 million annually to STEM education. The entire size of Dropbox's, the Dropbox Foundation's endowment, is in the tens of millions. And so if we were giving to STEM, that would be a relatively very small slice of the pie compared to what Microsoft is doing. Whereas if we choose something more neglected among other tech funders, then that would have an outsized impact relative to the grant size that we're giving. In terms of having natural linkages to our product, we were getting a lot of inbound feedback from various human rights organizations saying, we're sharing sensitive client data between lawyers, between clients, and Dropbox is a really secure platform to share files through. So that was interesting that we were getting so much inbound feedback from human rights-based NGOs and nonprofits, and coupled together with the neglectedness criteria that I mentioned and enthusiasm among the whole company base, we decided to make ourselves a human rights foundation. This is a little bit about the question of how do we incorporate this thing? And again, for the sake of time, I won't go into detail in it, but I wanted to highlight some of the differences between a private foundation on the one hand being something that the organization founding it has a lot of control over, but it being a relatively high administrative burden to set up. And because the team was me and my manager, we didn't really have the capacity to start a whole new 501c3. And then a donor-advised fund on the other side of it is relatively plug and play, but it's technically not a foundation. And Dropbox wouldn't be able to have seats on the board of directors. And so we wanted something in the middle, which is where we came to this supporting organization, which is like a hybrid between the two. So the Dropbox Foundation is a subsidiary of the Rockefeller Foundation. Actually, they're our partner. And they help manage a lot of the admin and overhead to make that easier for us. And then to speak a little bit about the grant making strategy, and I hope this is interesting. This is just sort of a walkthrough of some of the strategic decisions that we made along the way. So you'll see on the kind of left-hand y-axis, these are different ways to give grants, each of which has advantages and disadvantages. So confetti is sort of like small grants, let's say $5,000 grants, spread out amongst a ton of different organizations and a ton of different causes. This strategy, we decided, wouldn't necessarily have a high impact on the human rights organizations that we were trying to target, and difficult to have strong brand identification with grants that are so small. Clustered, on the other hand, is sort of similar, except you're picking maybe a couple different thematic areas and then giving to many different organizations the small grant size. Concentrated is similar to clustered, but you're picking only a few partners. So maybe between 1 and 5 partners for the entire year that you are really focusing on. These are deep partnerships, and that was the model that we ended up choosing because of impact, sort of building a story for our brand identification, and morale and retention, having deeper relationships with our grantees. And then ecosystem change is sort of even a step further on the impact side, where as a funder, you're working in partnership with government and other nonprofits. But that has a much more complex and longer time horizon to see the impact. Maybe ecosystem change organizations are working on like a 10-year time horizon, which is more difficult for the middle and right-hand columns. So we decided to do a concentrated grant-making model. So all of that is sort of background to get to the more substantive points about power sharing. Because throughout this process, I didn't want to recreate examples of bad philanthropy or being like a poor corporate steward. So I asked nonprofit partners that we had been working with on the Dropbox for Good side, sort of ad hoc, hey, we're starting this foundation. What's something that you want to see more of from corporate donors? And what I heard over and over again from everybody that we talked to is more unrestricted funding. So when a donor gives a grant, it can be programmatic, meaning I'm giving you X million dollars to build this facility. There's some string attached. There's some outcome that the funding is tied to, versus unrestricted funding, which can go into marketing, can go into hiring, it can keep the lights on, it can do a lot of, for lack of a better word, unsexy things that donors might not be as thrilled to talk about, but that nonprofits desperately need. There's a TED Talk by Dan Pallotta called "The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong" that I highly recommend in case folks haven't seen it, that illustrates this point, where the for-profit sector is incentivized to grow sort of all the time, right? That's venture capital, that's investment. But nonprofits don't have the same incentive structure, and so we wanted to proactively offset that balance. And to give an example of how important this is, I was talking with one of our partners who said, we recently got this fantastic grant to buy more hygiene kits, get more showers, to help folks who are experiencing homelessness prepare for job interviews and increase the likelihood that they'll get employed. And they said, the grant was great, but we told the donor that what we really need are more beds because our facilities are sort of outstripped of capacity every night. But because this was a program-based grant tied to a specific outcome, they didn't get what they actually needed, even though they were still able to take the hygiene kits because it was better than not having anything at all. So that's power sharing example number 1, unrestricted funding. Power sharing example number 2 is deferring to the wishes and the needs of the partner that you're supporting before you show up and do volunteer work. So the kind of, worst example of volunteering is 30 people show up to a youth homelessness shelter and say, we want to help for the day. We want to work with the kids, but the kids have, trained social workers, counselors. It's a tightly dialed in sort of administrative process. And it ends up being a burden to sort of absorb those 30 people. And so what we wanted to do was ask all of our partners, what particular skills would be really useful to lend to you on sort of a short-term time-bound basis. And we created this online platform where one of our partners would say, we need to redesign our fundraising website. It would be great to get, 10 engineers time, 3 hours a week for the next month, something like that. And then Dropbox staff could go into this platform and see the list of different projects that people were requesting and click them and use their 32 hours of paid volunteer time off to do these skills-based volunteer projects. So that was another way of saying, we're not going to just decide to volunteer, but we want to listen and defer to the expertise of the people who are on the ground actually doing the work before we plug in and help them as needed. So in sum, the Dropbox Foundation launched in 2013. It offers 100% unrestricted grants and skills-based volunteering coupled with every grant. There are grantees in 13 global locations where Dropbox offices are located. These are concentrated, 3 to 5 year partnerships between 100 and 200K per year, and to date has supported 16 human rights organizations around the world. Before I get into the academic side of the conversation, I wanted to just pause there and see if anybody has questions on the case study so far.
If you do, you can just say me in the chat, and then we can just call on you, or you can post your question in Q&A, and then you can either read it yourself or I can read it for you. I do not see any questions, but I do want to comment, marketing is all about identifying your customers' needs and wants, but so often in philanthropy, that's just not done. And you're really talking about this whole idea of, yeah, don't just say, we really want to play with the kids. Well, okay, that's no longer philanthropy, that's entertainment. What do the kids need? Maybe the kids don't need you to play with them. Maybe they need math tutoring, or maybe they need you to help build something. Or maybe they just don't need a bunch of you there. So
Yep.
I think it's such a great example of applying consumer behavior 101, which is find out what your customer wants and needs and give it to them instead of just building it and hoping they come, to the context of philanthropy. And it's sad that that's rare. I mean, it's kind of like it seems sort of like when you talk about it, it's like, well, of course we should do that. And yet the example you gave, I've seen so many examples of that because I used to be one of those people who volunteered in various organizations in college and high school, and we would just kind of show up and be useless. And some of us were useful, and some people were just hanging out. And so I just think it's such a great thing to remind us that these principles should apply to philanthropy, not just to selling stuff.
Definitely, and that's actually a very good segue into some of the theoretical perspectives. And so I'm going to go over two. These aren't the only two on sort of power sharing and changing philanthropy. But the goal here is just to familiarize you with some of the concepts that are out there rather than doing a really, really deep dive on each one. And then we can have a bit of a discussion. So I want to start with participatory grant making. In traditional philanthropy, the way that philanthropy has operated for, centuries is that you have a board of directors at the top sort of having the ultimate authority and setting the strategic direction of an organization. You have the executive director or CEO running that organization, and then program staff sort of on the ground making funding decisions that then go to the grantees that work on behalf of the community. And what participatory grant making does is flip this on its head. So it's actually the community making funding decisions that then inform what the grantees do and the program staff, etc. And this is where the quote, "Nothing about us without us," comes from. A participatory approach acknowledges power and breaks down barriers to it. So I'm quoting from Gibson here, who did seminal work on participatory grant making. Participatory grant making cedes decision-making power about funding, including the strategy and criteria behind those decisions, to the very communities that funders aim to serve. And when we talk about the participants in participatory, so that includes residents of a particular community as well as activists, partners, peers. It's really a broad group of stakeholders. The goals are number one, to make effective philanthropic investments, but also to increase participants' sense of agency, power, and leadership. And quoting from the same article here, participation is not just about making grant decisions. It's about rethinking your role as a funder on a daily basis and seeking community participation in all layers of your work. True participation is about supporting, learning from, and partnering with grantees. Participatory grant making is values based. And the second point here is really important. Participatory grant making, the process itself is an important outcome. And by that, I mean, if you put, let's say, wealthy people who are in a privileged position of power to be able to donate in the same room as people who have less privilege, are historically disadvantaged or marginalized, that exchange in and of itself is valuable and might not happen in a non-participatory setting where the funders are just, in high rises south of Market Street making decisions, but never actually interact with the communities that they're supposedly benefiting. So proximity and relationship building is an extremely important part of this process that's more than just about giving money. But there are challenges as well. It can be resource intensive, when you involve many, many stakeholders instead of just the program officers, CEO, board that I mentioned. It can be harder to build consensus. You have more cooks in the kitchen. And just to pause, can anybody think of an example where you might not want to have participatory grant making?
If you want to share your example, you can just say me in the chat and I'll call on you. I can't think of one.
That's okay.
I guess intuitively I can think of one, which is just that there's people who will be participating whose views you don't like, respect, or want, which doesn't sound very good. It sounds kind of selfish in the context of philanthropy. That doesn't sound
Correct.
good, but
That's right. So when you're dealing with something like, let's say, a public health issue, a pandemic, you might want to have a really authoritative body making decisions on behalf of the community rather than opening up for more community input where that's going to slow down, policy implementation, people having safe instructions on what to do, etc. So there are certain cases where more top-down sort of authoritative methods actually might better serve the community than a more participatory model.
I had an anonymous person. I mean, they wrote and said they don't want to be called out by name. But this person, who will remain unnamed, said, what about, for example, if it's a male-centric area where you're trying to help women, right? Where some of the people on the board aren't part of the group being helped, and you think maybe they don't understand. And maybe their views aren't necessarily as informed, and
Yep.
they're not as helpful.
Yeah,
Great.
absolutely right. So an important pretense is that the participating group should be knowledgeable and ideally have lived experience in the particular social issue that they're working to change. So to give an example in the real world, the Pride Foundation was founded in 1985, operates in 5 states, and since 2020 has given $665,000 in community grants that were directed by sort of a more grassroots bottom-up method for things like HIV/AIDS prevention and support, mental health, gender-affirming care, mental health support resources, etc. So this is a really awesome example of an actual organization that's sort of embodying the principles of participatory grant making. I want to shift to the second academic area that I mentioned, which is systems led leadership. So, systems led leadership is distinctly different from social entrepreneurship. And many of you may have heard the term social entrepreneurship before or familiar with it in practice. But in social entrepreneurship, we tend to put the entrepreneur at the center of the story. Particularly in an American cultural context, we love the sort of allure of Steve Jobs founding Apple, right? And in the case of social entrepreneurship, someone might be thinking, what problem am I solving? And how does me solving it give meaning to my life? The concept of systems-led leadership, as in contrast to that, is that you are a grain of sand on a much bigger beach. And you work in a much broader systemic context. So it's sort of it's trying to do work for the sake of a cause where there's no ego whatsoever, but we look at our unique skills and where we fit into that system to help it. So the idea here is you are not the leader, the system is the leader, hence the term systems-led leadership. So you might want to first understand what the problem is, right? Because not every problem is going to have a market-based solution that an entrepreneur can solve. But a market-based solution like starting a business or a social enterprise might be one tool in a much bigger toolkit that includes policy change, activism, education, funding. So rather than kind of forcing a social problem to fit into a business model, you first understand the problem really deeply and then think of what the appropriate strategy is to address that problem. And this is also where sort of who you are as a person can inform your approach to systems-led leadership. So are you someone who naturally is really connected? Do you have a big social network? Because bringing people together, getting everybody to sit around the same table and talk about solutions to climate change for something, for example, might be really valuable. Are you an educator? Do you like to teach? I love to teach. I love doing stuff like this. So that might be a unique way that you sort of fit into this. How can you fill a gap for a social movement that's already underway that many, many people are involved in? So to give a specific example of this, let's say you are passionate about climate change. In, let's say, a more traditional social entrepreneurship model, you might start a solar power business and you want market share. You want your business to grow. But that's inherently meaning that you're taking market share away from other solar companies that are doing the same thing. So rather than kind of fighting over pieces of the same pie that everyone is interested in, right, which is a clean energy transition, you might think about how do we change the marketplace to incentivize more green investment? How do we change policy, et cetera? So it's more of a, we're all sort of fighting for the same end. How do we get there together? This last slide I'm drawing from a piece by Nickel and Eikenberry, which is one of my favorite pieces of critical scholarship on philanthropy. But these are a few high-level takeaways from their article that summarize some of the points that I've been talking about. So the best way to end suffering is not necessarily just to give money, but voice to those who suffer. So this is where some of what we discussed about seeking input, letting others guide your strategy, deferring to others' expertise, that voice and political agency can be really meaningful in shifting power dynamics. Other strategies alongside philanthropy, including labor organizing, political leadership, social movement leadership, are in line with this more transformative philanthropic discourse. Joining donor interests and experiences with needs in the community, that's where the participatory model comes in. And then as a funder, choosing organizations that are inherently status quo disrupting would be the fourth recommendation there. So I wanted to end on kind of practical bite-sized takeaways for folks who maybe want to get into social entrepreneurship or corporate philanthropy, CSR, to think about as you think, what would I do if I was building a new strategy, launching a new organization, building a new program for a company, etc. So I'll end there and we can transition to Q&A.
Thank you so much. And we do have some questions that were posted. Let me see if there's any questions in Q&A because I'll give priority to those. I think I see one question in Q&A and two questions in the chat, but the questions in the chat came first, so I will start with those. And I believe the first person who had a question was Charles. So Charles, if you can unmute yourself and turn on your camera, you can ask the question directly, or if you prefer to have me ask it for you, just say so. But we'd rather hear your lovely voice.
Okay. So thank you very much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I think it serves to point a number of difficulties in dealing with charities and the whole nest of things that have to be considered. My question comes from the motive of organizations when they give unrestricted grants. One would tend to think that an unrestricted grant, as you so correctly noted, doesn't come with any strings. But how does the corporation benefit from that when you would think that their motive is to be recognized as providing that?
Excellent question. Yeah, thank you, Charles. This is where I think killing two birds with one stone, or actually a flip on that I prefer, feeding two birds with one scone. It's a little more positive, you know.
Oh, that's so much better. I'm keeping
Right, right.
Yeah.
So this is where having a creative and collaborative partnership between the funder and the grantee can really make a difference for how the funder then talks about that from a branding and marketing perspective. So I'll give you an example. We gave $100,000 unrestricted grant and deferred to the grantee for how they wanted to use it. They used that to hire a senior fundraiser, right? A new development officer. That person then brought in $7 million the following year, which went to their core programs. Which for this particular nonprofit, you know, they work in war zones, removing kids from danger and providing sort of wraparound mental health services for kids who are in wartime. That became a really compelling story, right? Of like this multiplier, $100,000 that if that had gone first to the core program, you know, that would make a much smaller impact than it did because they hired that person who had more capacity to really grow the organization. And so that was like a co-branded sort of blog post that we did in collaboration with each other. So yeah, I think you just, with unrestricted, you have to be a little bit more creative in how you align your bottom line with the social impact of whatever they end up using the grant for.
Thank you. I think it goes back to what you said earlier about flipping the script, so to speak, and going to the community first to find out what is needed, and
Yep,
then, you know, implementing a program whereby you address those needs.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, super
That was
important.
that was a great question. I know Charles has been was very involved with a lot of philanthropy
yeah,
because he's
yeah.
a student. Fantastic. So moving on to, I have a question from Nicholas that I see in the Q&A.
Hello, and thank you so much for the great presentation and for also hosting this event. It's also fun that the first two questions are connected to unrestricted funding, which I think is also a sign that it doesn't happen very much, but it should. But I am very interested in hearing about what pushback you received either internally within the organization when you were building that and proposing that idea, and also if there was any kind of pushback or eyebrow raising from peer organizations.
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you, Nicholas. I got really lucky with how we set this up. It was a combination of luck and a lot of hard work. Um, but when I was fairly junior in my career, launching these programs, there could have been a scenario where the founders at Dropbox weren't taking it seriously, and they were kind of just like, "What is this entry level recruiting coordinator doing?" You know. But a guy who was the head of the legal team, the chief general counsel, came to all the meetings. He was really into it, and he sort of became the bridge of legitimacy between me and the founding team and the rest of the C-level staff, and became kind of an informal mentor to me. So I had an opportunity to have these long conversations with him where I was meeting with all of our nonprofit partners in San Francisco, Larkin Street Youth Services, the Food Bank, Reading Partners, et cetera, et cetera. And they were all saying, like, we're starved for unrestricted grants. We're starved for operational funding. And I made that case first to the head of legal. And I think that he really agreed with it, and was able to make a case that, this is the right thing. Like, this is in line with our values. This is what we should do. So, so not a lot of pushback actually, but a lot of enthusiasm internally. And this was something that the sort of nonprofit ecosystem that we were working with started to really celebrate. And as I've, continued to embark on my journey in philanthropy and doing the PhD and stuff like that, I go to conferences and everybody's talking about unrestricted funding now. And I'm like, yes, that's great. It's like more common. It's more in the conversation now than it used to be, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Another excellent question and a really great answer. So the next person I see with a question is Jazeera. Are you comfortable unmuting yourself, or do you want me to ask for you?
I can ask it.
So you have, I just saw your message in the chat. I apologize. You left me a message in the chat that there's noise in the background. Jazeera, do you want me to ask it, or are you okay asking it?
You can ask it.
I just saw it. Okay, now I have to find the question. Oh goodness. Okay, all right. Wait. I'm gonna find it. I will prevail. How can emerging leaders balance the need to listen deeply with the need to take action in social impact work? Because if you listen too much, meanwhile, you're not necessarily making an impact while you're just listening.
Totally, totally. This is a great question. And I think it plays to that example that I gave earlier. If you're responding to like a crisis, what we saw in 2020, like you need to act quickly. So I think it really varies on a case-by-case basis, depending on the problem that you're trying to solve. So if there's a natural disaster, if there's fires in Sonoma County, that would be a case where leadership needs to act quickly. You need to get whatever resources you can to the local fire department. You need to deploy funds quickly. You defer to community foundations or other institutions that are already sort of embedded and have the processes in place to move quickly. If you're working on a more complex problem, how do you slow down climate change? How do you make it less likely that countries will go to war with each other? How do you reduce the sort of risks of advanced artificial intelligence? These are all things where really listening and making sure that we do it right, sort of like there's that trade-off between sort of quality and time. You need to take it on a case-by-case basis of what the issue is, because certain issues you don't want to move too quickly that you do it wrong and you kind of break things along the way.
Yeah, that's a really great question and answer because it really does depend. It depends, right? A fire is an emergency, and the bigger global bring world peace, that might not, that might be an emergency in some ways, but it's a more complicated, less
Yeah.
obvious what the answer is. Fantastic. Okay. I also see a question from, oh, wait, I see it. I'm going to give a chance to someone who hasn't asked yet, and Randy will get you at the end. Thank you. I see a question from David. Oh, it's a great question too. Do you want me to, and thank you for bringing that up, David. David, do you want me to ask it or can you unmute?
I thought I was unmuted.
Oh, no, okay, ask away. Ask away. Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Well, hi, Joe.
Hey,
The
Dave.
question, the great presentation. The question is, do you ever have reservations about taking donations from, companies that are, have sketchy kind of political um, beliefs, or like Tesla, or like, let's say Qatar wanted to give you money.
For a plane,
Yeah.
a $400
Yeah.
million luxury jet, for example, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. And 100% yes. Any nonprofit organization that's taking in funding, um, they have a responsibility to advance their mission, right? That's kind of the purpose of having a mission. And in some cases, if you're accepting dirty money, that's going to hurt the mission more than you can do with the funds that they give you. And so, to give an example, um, one of the Dropbox Foundation's grantees, amazing organization called Witness, based in New York, and they protect and defend human rights activists by using video. So you might document something like police brutality in Brazil, and then this organization works to protect those folks who are then at risk of sort of authoritarian crackdown. Um,
Hmm.
and Meta is one of their donors, who they might disagree with some of the sort of privacy or data security policies that the company has, but they disclose that publicly on their website and saying, we're receiving funding from these sources. We don't necessarily ethically agree with everything that they do, but we want to be honest about that because we still thought the trade off was worth it for us to be able to keep the lights on and do what we do. So, so yeah, absolutely, it's a trade off. There are certain things, there are certain ethical lines I think that can't be crossed, but as long as you're honest about it and sort of forthcoming about where the money's coming from, that avoids bigger like public perception problems and conflict of interest and things like that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Another great question. Do we have time for one more, Joe? Is that
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
okay? Jazeera, I hope Jazeera's already been okay. Randy, because you've already asked a question, I'm going to go to Christina and then I'm going to go to Randy. Great. I guess I'm now asking if we have time for two more. Christina.
Oh, can I ask a question?
Yeah, we just called on you. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Uh, what a journey. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. So meaningful and special. You said when you graduated from college in 2011, you wanted to do something good. So what can you do? You joined the Peace Corps, right? I have many students, graduating this May with a big heart. So eager to do something good, but don't know exactly how. And what kind of advice would you like to give them to, many of graduating seniors in May, this May soon?
Great question.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question. What a wonderful question too. So um, one piece of advice might be to try something and see what comes of it. Because when I joined Dropbox, I had no idea that I was going to work on philanthropic programs. I thought I would be a recruiter maybe for a year or two, go back to school, and then pursue a more social services oriented job. So social impact can come in many different forms, some of which we might not expect. Um, the Peace Corps was a fun way to just try something. I think it probably impacted me as an individual, more than I could want to help anybody else. But to even play a small role, I still keep in touch with some of my students. One of my students who I tutored in English works for the Mongolian parliament now, and it's just really, really fun to keep in touch with her. And so I think whether you are wanting to go into a career in government or the private sector or the nonprofit sector, or you want to start your own business, or you want to make art, you can do any of those things with an impactful lens, right? So I think having a lens for I'm clear about the type of change I want to make, and there are many, many different avenues that I can do to get there. I think that's more important than the particular avenue that you choose.
Yeah, that's a great point. That we can do it for wearing very different hats. That you don't have to
Yes,
put a nonprofit in
and
order to.
everybody plays their part. Corporations need to be sort of better stewards. Government needs to enact policies that represent their constituents more. It's all part of the same ecosystem.
Yeah, you can be both lobbying and doing, which is
Yep.
within whatever organization you're in. Fantastic. So I don't see any new questions, and I do think we got to be fair to Randy, who's been patiently waiting with his questions. So, Randy, are you comfortable unmuting yourself again? You did a great job last time. So,
Yeah, it should be fine.
great. Ready?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So thank you for the talk. My question, I asked was, how do corporations and private donors, hold on, let me look at my question again. I asked it a while ago. Hold on. It says, how do they better market their philanthropy in a changing space? Because this stems from kind of back to what someone was previously mentioned was Elon Musk and his role he currently has in kind of trying to lead the charge to take away people's Medicare and all that. So how do you better market philanthropy in when I feel like the environment is becoming more hostile towards corporations and private donors, like using Elon Musk for an example?
Yeah, a great question. I have a few thoughts on this, and then I might actually defer to Michelle as a marketing expert to see what you think too. But my initial take is companies have a lot of different avenues through which they reach the public. So there's media, right? You can talk to journalists. There's branding. There's your website. There's what the leadership says when they're at a public event, whether that's a customer event, etc. Mark Benioff from Salesforce decided early on that philanthropy was important to him. And he talks about what Salesforce does, any opportunity, any interview that he has, right? And whether you like Mark Benioff or not, he really effectively has sort of catalyzed a movement through the 111, if people are familiar with that. It's like 1% of revenue, profit, and time, which is a fairly catchy, easy way for companies to adopt. Oh, okay, they're doing it this way. We should just adopt the same standard. So I think thinking about what all those different avenues are and hitting them. And then the second thing I would say is it needs to be really authentic,
Yeah.
because the public can typically suss out when it's like a hollow promise that doesn't actually have any backing behind it, or you're trying to capitalize on a movement that doesn't really suit you actually. So if it's kind of like posturing over social media or something like that, people are generally going to suss that out. But if you can put real resources and a real effort behind what you're saying, and it's real, it's authentic, then that becomes a much more effective message. But Michelle, what do you think on that?
Yeah, no, I think your answer was excellent. I second everything you said. I think it's interesting, we talk about branding, and brand personality is a lot like human personality. And I guess we could think of Tesla, we could think of Elon Musk. Those are two different entities, but of course they're very closely tied. And the Elon Musk brand as a person has taken a major hit, especially with the key customers of Tesla, which are, affluent, educated, and generally very progressive people who at least believe in global warming and care about the environment and also can afford luxury. And those are people who are, obviously not looking at Elon Musk the same way. And what you said is so true about authenticity. We can think about how we feel about brands and how we think about people. If people are always saying, "Oh, I really care about others and I'll always have your back," but they never have your back, or they say that, they are super committed to something, but you always see them acting in ways that aren't in line with what they said, you don't trust them. They're inauthentic, and all that stuff they said ends up hurting them because they just seem so disingenuous. That's even worse than someone who maybe isn't a super good person, but isn't a pretender. And that's true with brands as well. So it maps on. I mean, what you said was much more, I think, intelligent. But it is basically, as we see people, as we judge people for what they do and not what they say, that's the same thing about brands. And so if you're inauthentic, if you are just greenwashing, for example, in the sustainability space, or whatever it is related to philanthropy, where you're talking the talk, but you're not walking the walk, you actually lose more points than if you weren't talking or walking, because at least you're not pretending. So I think that's a really good point, that authenticity is so important. And if the environment changes and you authentically still care and you're listening, as you have suggested, to the people you're trying to help instead of just, imagining what you think they might need or what you want to give them that they may not want at all, then I think you'll do fine. And just like as people, right? If we're truly committed to something and we make a mistake, people are much more forgiving than if we're clearly talking, but we're not walking in the same direction. So yeah, I think what I said is more obvious than what you said, but it is a great question as well, like all the others. So thank you so much for that. I don't think we have any more questions. So before we go, I want to make sure everyone has a chance to unmute themselves. Rob, you're my technical guru extraordinaire. If you can invite everyone to unmute themselves, and if everyone can unmute themselves and express our gratitude together, semi in unison, if we can, I'll count to three, just to let Joe know how much we appreciate it. What an excellent talk. What a relevant topic for St. Mary's College. It's always thinking about societal impact. And what an excellent audience. So I actually want to thank the audience for really outstanding questions. I actually learned from both the questions and the excellent answers. So get a count to three. And if everyone can just say, thank you, that was great, or whatever you want to say, even though it's going to sound okay. One, two, three. Thank
Thank
you.
you,
Thanks,
Joe.
Joe.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
And Giant, thank you to the audience for making it just an excellent experience for all of us. Thank you for coming to an excellent event. And Joe, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your insights on a topic that's important and more important now than ever before because of some of the changes, especially in the United States, but across the world. There has to be more effort on the part of us people since the government is probably going to be doing much less in the near future and hopefully not in the distant future. Thanks again, everybody.